and thank you for joining us today. Today's webinar is part of our GC Advantage program. It's our professional development program for corporate legal and compliance leaders. The topic today is preparing for your first year as general counsel. We also have a couple upcoming webinars. In May, we have Doing More with Less, Managing Work, Developing Talent with an Ever-Tightening Budget. And then June, we have Building, Mentoring, and Coaching Diverse Teams. We also have a library of previously recorded on-demand webinars. And today's presentation is being recorded and will be added to that library in about 3 weeks. An email will be sent to everyone who has registered once this material is available on the website. Today, if you have questions during the webinar, please submit your questions through the Zoom platform. There'll be a Q&A icon at the bottom of the application. And you'll also be able to see questions that have already been submitted. And if you just take a look at those and see if there's one that's already addresses the question you have, in that case, you can just give it a thumbs up to have that question go to the top of the queue. We'll do our best to answer all the questions that come up today. And if there is any technical issues you have, please use the chat feature to communicate with our support staff. I'm pleased to introduce Michelle Banks. Michelle is one of the distinguished senior advisors on our team, and she has extensive experience in-house. She was a general counsel at Gap, which is one of the world's largest apparel retailers. And she's active in many nonprofit organizations and probably one of the most highly sought after executive coaches in the legal community. I think she's has probably a year or two of people waiting to get on her schedule. So Michelle, welcome, and thank you for leading today's webinar.
Thanks, Bob, and I'm excited to be here. I saw some familiar names amongst the registrants, so it's exciting, and I'm looking forward to leading the webinar. And as Bob said, I have been a public company general counsel. I've also worked in-house at a private company. And in the instance where I was a public company general counsel, I was promoted internally as opposed to being hired externally. And we are going to talk about both of those today, making effective general counsel transitions, whether you are staying at the same company or approaching a new opportunity. As Bob said, I also encourage you to feel free to submit questions at any time via the Zoom Q&A function during the webinar. I will do my best to make sure that we save about 15 minutes to answer questions, and we'd love to answer as many questions and talk about the topics that are as most relevant for you all today. I am really thrilled that joining me today is Juliette Pryor. Juliette is the Executive Vice President and General Counsel of the Albertsons Companies, which, as some of you may know, is the nation's second largest grocery retailer. Juliette has amazing experience, having been a general counsel 4 times, and I'm really excited that she has agreed to do this dialogue with us via webinar today and talk about how she has been so successful making general counsel promotions. So I wanted to mention, before I start asking Juliette some questions, that I wrote an article recently, and everyone who is registered for today's webinar will tomorrow receive an email from our staff at Barker Gilmore with a copy of the article I co-authored. The article is titled "All Aboard: Successful Transitional Steps for a New General Counsel." In the article, we got advice from executive coaches, myself, as well as 2 others. And we also received advice from 4 very seasoned general counsel who, like Juliette, have been a GC in an internal promotion as well as an external hire situation at multiple companies. So I thought it was a big deal that I was a general counsel for 10 years, but I'm in awe of these people who have made 3 or 4 transitions. And I look forward to hearing more from Juliette's perspective. So Juliette, welcome and thank you. We are honored you took the time to join our webinar today.
Hi, Michelle. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thank you to Barker Gilmore for hosting this and for all the folks who are joining us today.
Great. All right. So my first question is, you have been promoted from within at 2 companies, Eastfire and US Foods, and you've been hired from outside at 2 companies, Cox and now Albertsons. So could you describe from your perspective, what were some of the key differences in the experience of becoming a general counsel with an internal promotion versus changing companies or even industries?
Yeah. So the way I think about those 2 different types of paths to the GC role, when you're promoted from within, you have the benefit of knowing the company, the business, the legal team, other members of the executive team, et cetera. And perhaps one of the challenges in that scenario is getting the organization to see you in a different light, right? And to allow you to sort of step into that leadership role and to be seen as a full member of the executive team, et cetera. But there are definitely advantages to having all of those levers of familiarity. I guess one other challenge I'd mention before I look at the other side is you also are moving from a group of peers that you're now going to lead. And that's an interesting dynamic to be able to manage, which is why wherever I am in a team, I'm really thinking about trusted relationships, because you never know who's going to be leading you or you them along the road, especially if you stay in places for a long time. And so if you're able to be thoughtful about that along the way, you have nothing to worry about if the position changes and you're now leading that team. Then when you're coming from the outside, and I have a very clear sense of preparing for my job at Cox, because it was the first time that I was taking the GC role coming from the outside. And so my 2 internal promotions happened back to back. And then I had consecutive opportunities of coming in from the outside. And that first time, I suddenly became very aware, oh my goodness, I don't get this window to sort of sit back and watch and learn and observe and prepare for taking the reins. And it clearly felt different that I came in as the leader. And at the same time, I was absolutely the person who knew the least about the company, the culture, the people, any of it. And so, so I think it's probably healthy that it helps you to be aware of the importance of your dependence upon and reliance upon relationship with others to be able to build your understanding and be able to step into this new role when you're coming completely from the outside. And the one other thing I'd say about my 2 roles coming in from the outside directly into the general counsel role, in both instances, it was also into new industries. So there was an absolute need to have, a lot of listening and a lot of questions and partnership with others within both the department and the larger organization.
Great. That is such helpful perspective. Very helpful. So let's go back to the 2 internal promotions, since you said those happened back to back and then you had the external hires. So is there anyone that you're very, first of all, committed to talent development? I know mentoring, succession planning, talent development are passions of yours. I enjoyed reading the recent article in the Black In-House Counsel report about you and about the fact that 8 of the people who have worked for you on your teams have become general counsel. I used to be proud that 4 of mine had become general counsel, and then you doubled my number. But so I know you're passionate about helping others, but who helped you? I mean, can you talk about what do you attribute to becoming a first time or a second time GC through internal promotion? And did people help you? And what kind of help was the most helpful?
Yeah. So absolutely, people helped me. The general counsel that I followed, both at Eastspire and at US Foods, having served as their deputies, were incredibly supportive to me. But there's a couple things that I did along the way. First is I articulated to them my career objectives, that I had an interest in becoming a general counsel, and not that I was, running for the door if I wasn't getting their chair or trying to undermine them in the role, but that I wanted their partnership and helping me to continue to develop. That was the first thing. I was just very open about that. And then secondly, I made clear to them that I valued and wanted their feedback around my performance and development all along the way. And that I didn't just want accolades, I wanted their critique. I wanted to hear from them, where can I improve? Where do I need to work to go to do better, et cetera. And I was fortunate in both instances to have from both David Eberhard and Riley Murphy, that they were willing to give me that feedback and engage in open and honest dialogue about growth opportunities, et cetera. And then the third piece is I saw in them people who were willing to give me stretch assignments, new assignments. And that's something I often talk to people about when they're figuring out, how do they get to that chair? If you're not in a place that's going to allow that, it makes it much harder to get to the general counsel role. If people are not allowing you new experiences, whether it's through a rotation or a special assignment, it gets much harder to build the set of skills and experiences to be that ready person for a future GC opportunity.
I agree completely. That growth or continuous learning mindset and stretching yourself and taking some risks is so important. And I think that one thing I would say about that is sometimes people have to be willing to work hard. Like that stretch assignment might be an extra. It might not, it might be on top of the day job. In other words, not just instead of. And the other thing from a leader perspective is I think you have to be careful that you're inclusive with those stretch assignments, because otherwise you can end up giving them sometimes unintentionally to the people who are just nearest to you. And you really have to think from an inclusion standpoint about giving them in a way that is more fair and equitable.
Absolutely. The other thing that I'd add is not to lose sight of the fact when we're talking about promotion from within, that while the general counsel that you may be following may have a significant voice in whether the organization fits you, selects you for the role, that's not who you'll be working for as the general counsel, and they may not have much of a voice in you being selected for the role. And so figuring out your relationship with the business, even if you're not sort of buddy-buddy with the CEO or the executive team, but thinking about your reputation inside of the leadership ranks as a ready talent, as someone that people want to work with, is something else to keep in mind. That's a careful one to sort of navigate, because you do have to think about your current relationship with your boss, the general counsel, right? But understand that perhaps may not be the person with the greatest voice or influence as to whether or not you are their successor.
Oh, I have stories about that, but that's for another day. Okay. Someone asked a question that is so on point. I want to jump in and ask it, which is, what kind of stretch assignments do you recommend? What kind of stretch assignments will help you become a general counsel? So my answer, and then let's hear your answer. I'll give you a minute since this wasn't a planned question. My answer would be anything that gets you in the boardroom and anything that gets you in the C-suite and anything that fills gaps in your experience. But I'm sure you might have a little bit of a different perspective.
I don't disagree with you, but I would put at the top of the list the gap in experience piece, right? So if you're seen as this really great senior litigator and your goal is general counsel, well, if there's an assignment in the commercial space or other areas of the company where you can get your get your teeth into an experience that's not perceived as your particular background, I think that's valuable. So I think there are many stretch assignments that can be valuable. I would also say that there are stretch assignments that are valuable to your being seen on the radar as a potential successor in the GC role, that it's not as much about the subject matter as it is about your willingness and your nimbleness. And I'm thinking of two people that I have coached in the past. One who took on an assignment when we were pursuing a significant merger, which required them to be very focused with the target company that we were merging with, and spending a lot of time outside of the business, but interacting with a whole group of senior leaders that were focused on this deal while the rest of us were running the day-to-day. And not only did it elevate visibility, but it demonstrated a kind of flexibility around dropping this area and going to this other area that was looked upon favorably down the road. And then the second example that comes to mind is the lawyer who was willing to take on what was perceived initially as possibly not a successful business venture. Like, I need someone on the team to go be the lawyer for this new venture we're trying out. And most people started sort of looking out the window like, please don't ask me. And oh, by the way, for this venture, you got to fly back and forth to this other part of the country every week for the next 6 months because we don't know what we're going to do here. That turned out to be a really great venture. And that lawyer was, ground floor for that business, and got a leadership opportunity in our company that I think distinguished them for their next step, which was a general counsel role, which happened to be outside of our company. But they got some skills and experiences that were different. So I think it's about filling gaps and demonstrating nimbleness and willingness to shift.
Okay, so let's talk about shifting to the outside. So now you're getting hired at Cox or Albertsons. Do you have a system? Like, you've done this so many times now. Do you have, do you take a certain amount of time off between companies? Do you have a certain type of research that you do? What, for example, do you read? Do you read like industry reports? What do you use to do your research, or who do you use? Do you use your law firms? Where do you get some insights and get prepared so you feel like you can walk into a new company in a new industry that you know little about?
So I would have said all of the above, except I'm terrible at taking off enough time for myself between jobs. And so I recommend to anyone else that they not follow my pattern and build that into the plan. But I absolutely leverage my network for industry insight and for understanding what's happening in that particular business, as well as how that business is operating within its larger sector, what's happening with the competitors, and then a fair amount of focus on the legal team. And let me say this. In the recruiting process, when you get the call that you're one of the folks being considered, if the process moves beyond, step one, I'm very focused on what do they want in this next general counsel? What do they think they want as a company? I'm also focused on why me, and that's not a insecurity statement. It's a help me understand what it is you think you see on paper about what I would bring to the role and how it ties to what you believe you need in the role at this time. Because leadership roles, different skills are needed at different times. And I have a sense of where I can bring my greatest value, and as well as what I enjoy doing as a general counsel. And there are very different types of general counsel roles. And so if there's not clarity around those things, and you want to go in to do X, but they really want Y, if there's not a connection there, it may not be the experience that you would have hoped it to be. And so, I spend time understanding the people, the culture, the business, the industry, the competitive landscape, and in particular, as much as I can from the outside, where is this company on its journey? What's the next, inflection point in the organization? So Albertsons was a pretty clear one. I specifically was going in because we were preparing for an IPO. And I've taken a company that was private equity held through an IPO before. So I understood the conversation when it came up. And I knew what that journey would look like. And so it really is about making sure that you understand the why behind you and the need that the organization believes that it has in going for this next talent and bringing someone in.
You said something that I think is really important, which is general counsel roles are very different.
Mhm.
That's my experience as well, having worked in-house at 3 places. I'll talk a little bit about what I see as the differences, and then I would love to hear more about what you mean by that, because I think this could be very educational, both for people who are aspiring GCs who haven't had the job yet, but also for people who are in the job and think the next job is going to be similar. In my experience, private company and public company GC jobs are pretty different. The regulatory framework and the speed and the expectations and the public nature is just different. The other thing in my experience is there are traditional and then there are modern GC roles, and that's just my language. The traditional GC role is the board secretary or general counsel is a note taker, and the lawyer is a trusted advisor to the senior leaders in the company who runs the legal department. In the modern sense, I think that the leadership aspect is really amplified. And in addition to the roles that I mentioned, there is an expectation amongst the board and the C-suite that the general counsel is going to contribute as a leader and as a business executive. Is that sort of consistent, or what else do you mean by different GC roles are different?
Yeah, I agree with what you've listed. What I would add is not only is public versus private a very different type of experience. I went from private equity owned, then IPO, and then went into family owned. So Cox is a 150-year-old 4th generation family owned business. I thought it was analogous to having spent years in a PE owned company, and it's also different in structure. So understanding those dynamics is a factor. The other thing that was different for me in Cox is it was my first organization that was multi-industry. And so Cox owns media business, cable business, automotive services business, esports teams. I mean, like a conglomerate. And that's a very different experience to be at the parent company of an organization that has its toe in multiple industries that may or may not be very related, and sometimes are not even complementary to one another. The other thing is, who does the business serve? So, you know, a B2B business, very different from a B2C business, and very different in terms of the experience of the lawyer. You having been in retail, you know, the dynamic of our businesses touching the customer and the public every day, and what that drives in terms of the speed of response and the type of issues is really, really different than an organization whose customers are other businesses. And so it's a different type of pressure and speed. A highly technical or high technology based business with heavy intellectual property, or a business that is very focused on its brand and marketing. And here's where I go with those points. There are businesses where the role of the legal function, I believe, is more at the center, more engaged, because the legal issue, either it's highly regulated, or when I talk about, you know, brand businesses like Gap, like Disney, like, you know, when you have those kind of brand issues, I think that pulls that legal team further into the conversations with the business versus a business that may not have had those types of issues. So I think all of those factors will weigh into what type of GC role you have. You know, I'll go all the way back to US Foods. I joined that company after a significant accounting fraud and restatement of financials when a turnaround team was brought in. And it was unclear whether it was going to have to file bankruptcy or sort of emerge from the ashes. Well, that was a very interesting time to have legal and compliance, because they had this burning platform. It's like, what else do you want us to do to be seen as good? Like, it's like, we need more people. You have this type of moment in time in the aftermath of that kind of a crisis. So all of those factors sort of go into your diligence around what might this particular general counsel opportunity or experience be for me.
I agree with that. And the one thing that I didn't mention that I would mention as well, and you've had both experiences, whether the company is global or domestic in orientation really changes the job quite a bit too. It certainly changes whether you're working 24/7.
Yes, absolutely.
I want to ask you, you started your last job during the pandemic. You actually interviewed, were hired, were onboarded. You had to spend your first entire year working remote, not meeting your team, not meeting your boss, not meeting the board. How did you do it? What are some best practices that you've learned along the way?
So I'll first correct you in saying, how am I doing it? I've still never met my boss. But, so just to put it in context, the process began before we all knew that we were headed into COVID. And so it would not be unusual to have a screening interview that was by phone, et cetera, because you didn't know if you were one of the, final candidates. When we got to the point that I was, a finalist, we were now in, the March timeframe, and the world had changed. And so, and it had changed, but it was still very odd to think that I would go through this whole process and make a decision all based on a bunch of video calls. I met board members on video, et cetera. And so that was still a new thing and an odd thing. I gave notice on a Zoom call. I had a farewell party with my team.
I hadn't even thought about that other side of it.
Yeah, I'm crying on Zoom, like I'm leaving. Yeah, it was just a lot. So there's that part of it. So I think when you're dealing with this situation, there has to be an incredible amount of structure and intentionality around connecting with people. So I already have, when I'm entering into a new organization, a cadence of team meetings, subgroup meetings, one-on-one meetings, my direct reports, my peers on the executive team, et cetera. And then you add to it that that's the only way for us to interact. You just sort of amp that up. And what I've had to be sure to add, and I'm sure many of us are doing this, but it was really important because I am new, was some fun on Zoom. So so some Zoom happy hours, and some Zoom trivia games, and those types of things as well, to help you build rapport and get acquainted with people. But it has been a challenge like none other to be brand new. My CEO and I know a couple of people in common we figured out along the way. And he said, well, I asked so-and-so, is she an avatar or is she real? Because I've never met her in person.
Wow.
So it's really about working on it. And just it's a more high touch experience. Quick notes, quick check-ins. I actually call people. We use the Microsoft Teams in our company. I will call people on unplanned times on Teams, my peers, my boss, et cetera. And I'm mimicking sticking my head in the door, right? And I'm intentional.
I wouldn't like that. Do people like that?
And if they're available, they answer. But if they're not, they won't. I might send them a quick chat. I don't love it, but I understand that if we were all together in Boise, sometimes I'd walk down the hall and bump into them and we'd have a chat. So I'm doing things to create that kind of interaction.
Yeah, you're mimicking what you would have done anyway. I like that. I think that probably is the best advice. Be yourself and show up as a leader the way you would, whether you're on video or in person. So you told me that, unlike me, you did not receive a human resources or boss created onboarding plan for your first 90 days. But it sounds like from what you just said that you have your own plan. You kind of have what you do. Can you talk a little bit more about what you do? Do you move fast? Do you move slow? How do you approach the first, 3 or 6 months?
So a couple things. Once it's announced that I'm joining the organization, I reach out to the people who will be my leadership team, who are there, who've just heard their boss is retiring and this new person we never heard of is joining. And I reach out to them. And at that point, I'm not trying to interrupt their days. I'm just saying, I'm looking forward to coming. I look forward to meeting you. Maybe I'm not coming for a month. And when we get closer to the date, we'll have a chance to catch up. But I just wanted you to know that I'm excited to join. So try to sort of take some of the tension out, because I'm thinking these people are going, wait, he's leaving, something's changing, she's coming, what's happening? And then when I get very close to the start date, like the week before, I have one-on-ones with all my direct reports.
Before you start? Before
I start. And again, just trying to take the pressure down on that intro. And I just sort of go, just wanted to say hello. Like it might be a 10-minute conversation. Introduce myself, I'm excited about next week. I have a lot to learn. I might tell them a little bit about me, but at least my direct reports have met me. They've heard my voice. They see me on the screen, whatever that is, but I do something like that. And then, at the same time, I'm gathering what we talked about earlier, building my knowledge base around what's happening, et cetera. Now, the one interesting thing that happened for me in this instance is between the time that I accepted the job and I think I had been announced, but I had already accepted the job. I think I'd been announced, and then George Floyd was murdered. And so, there was this series of conversations that leaders were having at both Cox and Albertsons. And I actually was involved in conversations in both of those places because this was such a pivotal moment that, for the team that I've been leading for the last 4 years, I wanted to ensure that I was helpful to whatever those conversations were happening. And then for the team that I was joining, I wanted to hear, because, the CEO was having a listening piece. So, I sort of listened in. He reached out to me. We had a conversation. So I understood what he was doing, but I wasn't joining until mid-June, a couple of weeks later. So it was a very, interesting moment. And that, that layered on top of what I would otherwise have been doing in that window between being announced and coming on board. So it was a little bit more interaction than would be typical. So once you start, day one, I meet with the entire department. I always try to meet the entire department the first day. Tell them a little bit about me personally, 3 sentences, and hear some of their questions. Tell them what I've heard about the team. I know we've done this and we've been through that and looking forward to this next adventure, et cetera. And then it's a long period, Michelle, of listening and asking questions. Maybe I shouldn't have said long. Somewhat impatient. So probably the first month, I'm just listening and asking questions. And what I'm trying to figure out is, where's the company going? How does the department fit into the company's, next leg of the journey? And is there a gap between who we are and what we have and who we seek to be? For example, are the functions within the legal department too siloed and the future state requires much greater collaboration, right? And so even my questions are going to be about, so you work on this and that team works on that. Do you guys coordinate on that? No. Well, that's interesting. How did it come to be that we don't do that part together? Isn't it the same client? Just asking, just understanding in preparation for whenever we start to talk about the vision for the future.
So that kind of leads to one question I have. When we wrote the article I co-authored the article, and we did a series of interviews with experienced general counsel. And one of the differences was speed. There were people who said, you got to have wins in the first 90 days. And there was someone who said, you shouldn't change anything for a year. You should listen, you should learn, then you should redesign, reorganize, change the culture. So are you a 90 days, we got to get this done, or are you a 1 year, or are you somewhere in the middle?
I personally lean towards the 90 days. However, I understand that you have to figure that out based upon the company culture and based upon what it is that you're needing to shift, right? So the reason I tend to be more of a 90 days, you know, if there are things that I see that are absolute gaps, then I'm gonna go quickly on that. So if, for example, there's a new business priority that we've never dealt with before, and we have no one in the team who's dealt with it, I'm gonna go get that skill more quickly and bring it in so we can be ready to deal with these issues. If there are leadership gaps in the direct report group, I'm gonna look at those things, or odd structural things. I'm gonna look at those things more quickly. But you do have to look at what is the corporate culture. Is it a culture that moves quickly? And what is the set of priorities? You know, sort of the why am I here? What did they bring me here to do? And based on what I was brought here to do, is that something that I need to focus on here or there? So if, for example, and I'm going to make this up, I was brought into an organization where they said, this legal team is, you know, humming in all these ways, and we just need somebody to help us figure out our IPO path and build a corporate secretary function, then I might focus on that more than a lot of other things. Everything else feels fine to you all. Let me just focus here. So it's those types of factors that build in. But I tend to believe you move quickly.
Well, that might be why you've got hired 4 times and been very successful. So you mentioned George Floyd, and I wanted to ask you before, I want to now go to the audience questions because I've seen a number pop up. So I want to have Bob ask you some of the audience questions in a moment. But before that, I had a question I wanted to ask you, which is just, do you have any lessons learned? What would you do again? What would you do differently? You've done this 4 times. You've done it from inside, outside. Do you have advice for people who are already GCs or want to become GCs that are any sort of lessons learned for you? And I would include in that, you are a Black woman, and do you have any different advice for women or for people of color, or is your advice basically the same?
So let's see, I'll take those as 2 questions. So the lessons learned, the reason I said a few minutes ago that how fast you go, you've got to really understand the larger organizational structure and culture. I mean, the corporate structure and culture, is because I've had the instances where I pushed a legal department design that the company was not ready to absorb. I've done that. And I brought in a talent that was excellent subject matter wise, but a horrible culture fit, and lost a lot of political capital and had to adjust. So to the point of speed, brought in a talent, wasn't the right fit. And once I was clear it wasn't the right fit, moved them out. All that happened in less than 100 days.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Okay.
Because the one thing I was able to salvage in that moment was to say, I'm a decisive leader. I'm a leader who can acknowledge if I've made a mistake, and this is not the right fit for our organization, and so we need to do it. So that's sort of where that is. In terms of how the factors of race and gender play into my leadership style and these discussions and decisions, I walk around with a very clear awareness of both race and gender, probably more race than gender most of the time, to be quite honest. And I am sort of behind the scenes, sort of processing, how are you responding to me? Are you responding to me in this role? Are you responding to me because I'm a woman? Are you responding, like, how is this playing out? I have to sort of push that down sometimes, because what I love to be is my authentic self. And that sort of noise in the background that causes me to sort of calibrate for someone else's lens or comfort may cause me to not be fully myself. What do I mean? When I first came into corporate America, I had this vision of what it meant to be a corporate lawyer, and I was a little too stiff and a little bit not enough myself, because these issues around race and gender and perception and so forth were too much in my head, to the point where I wanted to downplay and make sure everybody was comfortable and giving me the opportunities and those types of things. What I've learned is I am my best self as a leader, as a member of a team, as a lawyer, when I am my authentic self. I have more energy, I have more ideas, I am more engaged, I build better relationships. And so I have to be able to be that. And so I try to understand when I'm entering an organization, or when I'm deciding whether to enter, is whether or not there's space within that organization for Juliette to show up as Juliette. And if there isn't space for that, it's not the right place for me. Now, I do understand sometimes that I will enter an organization where perhaps people have not interacted very much with a Juliette. And so I may do some things to say, what you're getting from me right now, I'm not angry, this is passion. I feel passionate about this point. Like I may do that. I may describe a little bit more about the commonality of our human experience, more of my personal detail than maybe I want to share, but to help bring in we all have in common these human experiences. I'm the parent of two 20-something-year-olds. I have a college grad who quit his first job in 6 months. Like, yeah, you have that story too, right? And so it's bringing forth those aspects of me that help to drive that human connection, that help to dissipate some of those challenges that we have as humans, and focusing on the other and getting distracted by the other, and missing the opportunity to build stronger teams and stronger organizations. I don't know if that answers what you were getting at, Michelle.
It absolutely does. And I love it, because we came full circle, because you started with focusing on relationships and trusted relationships, and you sort of went full circle and got back there. And it might be more work, but you're really doing it. You're doing it with focus and intention. Bob, I'll turn it back to you and let you ask some of the audience questions. I did promise to leave 15 minutes for that, so I want to make sure we do that.
Well, thanks so much. And I've got to say, the number of questions we have is overwhelming. So
That's good.
There's definitely a lot of interest, and everybody appreciates the information you've shared already. So the first question, I'd be happy to hear how you convince another industry that your skills are transferable and that they should consider you. That happens quite a bit. So what are your thoughts on that?
It may be a little bit about my philosophy around the role of the General Counsel. And it may be a little bit about what I believe about myself. But my philosophy is the role of the chief legal officer in the company is trusted advisor, is taking the complex and boiling it down to its essence, communicating it in plain English, helping the organization understand its risk appetite and how to manage and mitigate through those risks. I'm always, frankly, Bob, always baffled by those who think of this role as being so bound to what the industry is. Mm-hmm. I think there are other factors that are greater in terms of common experience. So if an organization said, well, you know, more than half of our workforce is unionized, okay, that experience may color a lot of what's happening. The B2B versus B2C, the global versus domestic. I even have questions about that, about how much that really feeds into one's ability to be successful in the role. But I think it's about talking about one's leadership and advisory skills. You know, in addition to having worked in-house 5 times, General Counsel 4 times, I've advised 6 different CEOs. So I've inherited CEOs in these jobs. Mm. And there's one, my favorite, up until now, but my favorite historically, we inherited each other. And we both used to tease and say, I wouldn't have picked him and he wouldn't have picked me. But I love the guy. And it was a relationship that I worked for. And so, and the work that he needed, the advice that he needed was not about the industry. Mm-hmm. It was about the leadership, about the strategy, about, you know, being in the boardroom, about these significant exposure matters. Those things are common regardless of industry.
Well, and I would add that Juliette touched on the importance of growth mindset or continuous learning. And I think giving examples of where you have taken a risk or you have taken on a challenge or you've taken a stretch and you've been successful is important. So I worked for an MBA team. I worked for a huge Japanese conglomerate, and I worked for a global apparel retailer. I worked in 3 industries that had absolutely nothing to do with themselves in-house. And what I agree with Juliette on is it's about risk management. It's about leadership. It's about becoming the trusted advisor. It's about being able to learn the business, being able to understand the financials in a relatively fast time period. But I don't think you have to have done it before.
Yeah, just from the executive search side, you know, we'll work with CEOs that, you know, sometimes they are very specific. I want somebody coming from the same industry. They feel very strongly about that. Other times, you know, they'll be more flexible to, you know, consider people who are, you know, athletes, shall we say, coming from another industry. So just to give another flavor to this. One other question here is, a person reports to the CFO as a general counsel instead of the CEO. And is this a red flag that the company leadership has a negative view on the GC's office? If so, what are some of the steps that a new GC can take in the early days to attempt to correct this negative view?
So I have to be careful here. I reported to the CFO at Cox. Mm-hmm. And Cox had subsidiary GCs as well. So I was a parent company GC and there were 3 subsidiaries, and all of those GCs reported to the CFO. And that had been the model for many, many years, except in one of the subsidiaries during a period of time, it had bounced to the president of that subsidiary and then back to CFO. So the legal function was in that model. At the same time, earlier in my career, I turned down a job specifically because the GC role reported to the CFO. Mm-hmm. So at one point I turned it down, and another point I went in eyes wide open and took on the role. I think it's it's not a model that I like. And I don't say that to be disparaging of my former employer or former boss. Mm-hmm. But it is an area to sort of probe and understand the rationale and the why, and how it works in terms of the checks and balances that I think are important in the corporate setting. So if you're the CEO and you're making strategic decisions, what's the framework within which you get the financial risk separate and apart from the legal risk when you're making certain decisions? How does that work? Or do all the legal risks get filtered through a financial lens? So it is something to be careful about. And there were certain things that were created, at Cox to help me before I came in, be comfortable about where my seat at the table would be, that were frankly different from my predecessor, because it was a concern for me that there wasn't the right checks and balances.
I think it's a red flag. I have clients who have done it. I have helped all but one of them get out from under it. I would work from the day you get there to fix it. It's bad governance. It creates conflicts of interest that should be avoided. But I agree with Juliette, if you're stuck with it, if it's your first GC job, you really want the job, everything else looks great, and this is the one issue, and you decide you want to go for it and see how it goes, and this might be a stepping stone, or you might feel that you can change it, which, as I said, I've helped lots of people change it. I would do what Juliette said, and I would get assurances up front. You need unfettered access to the CEO and the board. You need an ability to have your boss not know what you're working on. You need an understood protocol if you have to, for example, investigate your boss. I mean, they're just things that you're going to have to deal with up front. But if you have those understandings, it can be workable. The other thing is why? Why are you not reporting to the CEO? It could be that the person has 29 direct reports and it is just a structural administrative matter, or it could be that the CEO wants nothing to do with legal governance and compliance, and you've got a lousy situation, so you just really need to understand the why.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. So here's somebody who's at a large public company, and they're questioning whether to become a GC at a smaller private company is a good first step, or is that a step backwards?
So my challenge with the question, Bob, is there is a perception that two things. One, public is better than private and it's a step up. Two, you only go from one size company to a larger company. You don't go in the other direction. These rules we've created for ourselves, and we look how we're moving up the fortune ladder, if you will. I don't ascribe to that. I'm much more interested in what is the challenge or the opportunity in going to this next role. What is it that you will be able to meaningfully contribute in that role? And it could be that you're going to a small private company that will always be private, or it could be that you're going to a small private company that is going to be acquired or it's going to IPO. Like, there's got to be more to the story. So I haven't navigated my career sort of including or excluding steps because it's the appropriate next step. I actually was criticized for going from taking US Foods public to go to Cox, which was family owned. But I had reasons for doing it, including a multi-industry business and what that afforded from my experience set. So I wouldn't rule it out, is what I would say to the person raising the question. I would look at other factors.
And I would just add that we did a whole webinar on that last year, public versus private, and the pros and cons and trade-offs. And I would encourage people to check that out on the Barker Gilmore website if they're interested in exploring that on a deeper level.
Great. The next question is, as the heir apparent to the GC at my company, I wonder what is the most important areas of law, being a generalist, securities, corporate governance, et cetera, to focus on in the next year or two to prepare for the promotion to GC?
If you're the heir apparent, I would hope that the company is partnering with you and getting you exposure to the board and governance space. If you already have that experience, then it would be a more general filling in of gaps of areas that are not your subject matter expertise. But if you don't have that corporate governance space, that would be the focus. Can they make you the assistant corporate secretary? You know, like that would be where I would want to get grounded.
I think it's about gaps. So my own journey was that I was a corporate transactional lawyer who became a commercial transactional lawyer. I then ran the compliance function. I then ran the employment litigation function. I started the privacy function. So I think the opposite could have been a path too. If I started as an employment lawyer, then I probably needed to get some corporate governance experience, maybe some real estate transactional experience, depending on the company. So it's really, what is your skill set today and what is your skill set you want to build? And I want to be clear, it's not all about practice areas. If you're leading a team of 5 and the legal department is 50, you need more leadership experience too. So I would think about experience in terms of practice, but I would not think like a law firm lawyer that it's limited to practice. You also need to think about the gaps in your leadership.
Another question is, when accepting a GC position, do you negotiate what kind of resources and budget, including outside counsel spend, will be available to you? Do you negotiate a separation package in case the fit turns out not to be correct?
So I'll take them in reverse order. I think in terms of a separation package, if you're going to a sizable company, there's probably already a corporate standard as to what they have in place for all members of the executive team, and just making sure that you're getting that same deal, whatever that is. So if none of the executives have severance plans, you're probably not going to get one, and if they all have one, you should get the same that they have. With regard to budget and so forth, I've never negotiated that, but in the interview process, I'm asking about, I'm getting a sense from these interviews as to the perception about the legal function. You know, so is the perception that it's too big and it has tons of money, or is the perception differently, that there may be a need to invest further? Does there seem to be a sense that's articulated that, you know, we're not sure what it is, but when you get here, you can sort of right size it and we'll make the investment that we need? Something much more broad and general as opposed to specifics. Now, I do want to understand if there's some odd sacred cows about law firms and business people or others who believe that they own who our law firms are. And so, you know, those are the questions that I sort of work my way around to build a perspective as to whether or not I'm going to be able to come in and shape the team, both internal and external, in the way that I see as being needed for effectively supporting the business.
Well, we are at that point. It's just wrapping up at the hour here. So I'd like to really thank Juliette and Michelle for joining us today. As you can tell, again, there's many questions we weren't unable to get to, but there's just obviously so much interest and appreciation for the information you've shared today. Everyone will receive, again, an email with once this recording is posted on our website. And also at the conclusion of the session today, you'll receive an email, and would appreciate just taking 1 minute to complete the survey to provide some feedback on today's session. Again, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to having you join us here in the future. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Juliette, and have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.